So as all of you who watch my channel know, I am not a fan of the state, and we have a presidential election coming up. So I kind of wanted to go over the Biden camp, the Trump camp, what to expect for the presidencies, and really almost a pros and cons list of both. And I guess we're going to start with Uncle Joe here. Here's the cons for a Joe Biden presidency as I see it. Joe Biden he will be 78 in November. So Joe Biden is at the average life expectancy for a man in the United States. He obviously shows some signs that you would expect from a person his age physically. Obviously, there are plenty of gaffes to go around, and by gaffes, I don't really mean just maybe slurring words, maybe just stuttering a bit or something. I mean mental decline in the sense that he forgets where he is. He gets that lost look in his eyes, and he just starts rambling incoherently about nonsense. I mean, that sort of thing. So, taking that into account, this is why his vice president pick, I think, has hurt him in the polls. Now, some of the articles I have seen that have polled Democrats mean that the majority of Democrats don't expect him to live through his first term. So that's the majority of Democrats. Now, obviously, being at that age, his vice president pick is a concern. It's not that every president's vice president pick is a huge concern. Obviously, when Obama was running for president and he picked Joe Biden, it really wasn't that big of a concern at all because Barack Obama was obviously a young, healthy guy. We could see him playing basketball. He's running around. He's doing fine. So it wasn't really a concern that this guy, I believe Obama was still in his 40s at the time when he was first elected, maybe early 50s. Still young, a young guy. So his VP pick wasn't too big of a threat. However, Joe Biden being at life expectancy, half of Democrats expecting him to die within his first term of office really makes Kamala Harris a reasonable threat to be concerned with for at least taking over executive power. I mean, I remember in 2008 when McCain ran, and I believe McCain was 72. I think he was just in his early 70s. Obviously, that's still old. We have this pattern of voting and running really old people who are probably too old to be doing this in these high positions of power. But McCain's vice president pick was a concern largely because of McCain's age, and people were worried about his health. Obviously, people were concerned about the dipshit he chose to be his running mate, but those were valid concerns. Now, I think it's a very valid concern that Biden would be sworn in at an age that was older than Ronald Reagan after 8 years of office. I think that is a reasonable concern. So, age, especially compared with his incredibly, almost bipartisan, unlikable vice president pick, is definitely a con. Now, there's obviously policy problems. Not only are we going to get rid of, not only is Joe Biden going to get rid of the Trump tax cuts, Biden is going to raise them back not to where they were, but actually higher, especially on corporations. There's a lot of things that are going to hit corporations harder, certain avenues that they're not going to have to, lighten the burden of some of these pretty hardline taxes, and also depending on where you live, businesses in California might just be a thing of the past because California is going to be raising its state income tax as well. Couple that with tax hikes under Biden, industry in California is probably going to be going away for a while. There's not going to be nearly as much as there was. We're already seeing some of the signs of that now, let alone when they get the tax hikes. Now, the problem with that is I know a lot of people think corporate tax, why are you always defending corporations, yada, yada, yada. Well, here's the deal. When business becomes really expensive for businesses, they tend to pass that down to consumers. That's kind of the thing about economics. That's just the way that it works. So that's something that we should all be well aware of. We should all be concerned about, higher prices, which are already going to happen anyways because of inflation and what the government's doing to the dollar. But corporate tax hikes on top of that mean generally higher prices for consumers. Because I think a lot of people don't understand exactly how those things work. Consumer confidence is going to be really bad for the stock market. I expect if Biden won, we're going to see a complete 180 of what happened when Trump ran. Say what you will about Donald Trump, he brought consumer confidence with him. the market boomed after Trump won the election because this was a businessman running on cutting taxes and regulations. Obviously, businesses like that. Businesses don't like tax hikes. They don't like increased regulation. They don't like making it harder to do business. So obviously, consumer confidence will be going down. The stock market will be going down. Investing will take a hit. Now, as someone like me who collects gold and silver, it's great for the value of our gold and silver, but it's not really good for all these other things that really have a huge impact on the economy. Biden is also pretty hard line on gun control. Now, he's already mentioned that he's going to get Beto, hell yes, we'll take your AR-15s. He wants Beto to help him draft legislation to pass new gun control. And he's already put out a plan, he put it out several months ago, that under his proposals, you would either have to sell your semi-auto rifles back to the government, which is retarded because I never bought mine from the government. I don't know about you, but you would have to sell them to the government, or you would have to have them registered like machine guns under the National Firearms Act. And obviously, again, his vice president has even spoken harsher towards guns than he has because Kamala Harris has supported mandatory buybacks just like Beto has. She's also said that if Congress doesn't do something about the sale of guns in the first 100 days of her administration, that she would issue an executive order which banned those guns. And even when Biden called that constitutional, she just kind of laughed that off because that's what she does. And Biden actually has a record on gun control for his role in the assault weapons ban in the 90s. So I don't see that as being just talk. He also has said he wants to double the minimum wage. Now, that could be just talk because he's trying to get the Bernie voters. But obviously that would be completely horrible for the economy. To impose more than double the current minimum wage on every business in the country is going to have some pretty negative impacts on the economy as a whole. Now, I've said before that I don't think there should be a minimum wage at all. But obviously a $15 an hour minimum wage imposed on every business in the country is going to have some pretty dire effects. I see price controls happening after inflation. I mean, that's pretty much a bipartisan thing at this point. But I think he will do the more Nixon, Jimmy Carter-esque price controls, which price controls, of course, lead to scarcity if you understand economics, which these people don't, even though Joe Biden has been in politics for 50 years almost. I do see him increasing spending. Sadly, I think the spending under Trump is the new normal, especially in the COVID era. I also see the federal power expansion being, considering every president since Calvin Coolidge has expanded federal power, I don't see that stopping under Joe Biden, especially when one of the first things he talks about is a mandatory mask mandate at a federal level, which I don't know where you would get the authority from that, but then again, where do they get the authority for half the shit they try to do? Another thing, the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare 2.0. That's what he wants. It's more taxing, more regulating, more corporatism in the healthcare sector, and which will mean higher deductibles, higher premiums, and even shittier healthcare, because every time the government steps in to try to help in the healthcare industry, healthcare gets worse. Before the government got involved, healthcare was actually pretty fucking good. It was fairly cheap, affordable, reasonable. You didn't have to have health insurance. Health insurance wasn't tied to employment. We had a much better system, and then the government stepped in and tried to help. Which Obamacare, actually, I'm not a fan of Medicare for all. I certainly don't want the government to have a monopoly on healthcare. Unlike Kamala Harris, by the way, because Kamala supports Bernie's Medicare for all plan. But the Affordable Care Act might actually be worse. It is the worst of all possible worlds. It has made a bad system even worse. And then he wants to expand that. So there's no free market in sight for healthcare, even from the Republicans, which is another beef I have with them. Because they bitched about Obamacare for 8 years and basically just got rid of the mandate. That was it. You don't have to buy health insurance or be fined by the government now. Thanks, guys. We still have the taxes, regulations, high deductibles, extremely high premiums, health insurance tied to employment, all these horrible things we still have. So thanks, Republicans. But Biden is going to make that worse. Another problem I have here is Biden and his war record. Now, obviously, Biden served as vice president during one of the worst war administrations in U.S. history. Obama started 5 new wars with Biden as his VP. There's a reason that Obama and the Bushes and the Clintons are all supporting Joe Biden. Like, the Bush family supported Clinton last election cycle. They're supporting Biden this time. The neocons, the people who like the overseas wars, want Biden for a reason. And Kamala Harris has a very similar record of her support in the war. And to be fair, I'm going to talk about my cons with Donald Trump because I have plenty. I will say right off the bat that of the two, if I had a gun to my head, I would prefer Trump to win the election, just simply based on the fact that he's not going to do all of those things that I just mentioned. But that being said, I still can't vote for Trump. And I still don't want Trump to be president. It's just a situation of one or the other. And this summation is entirely the lesser of two evils, based on the impact we're going to have from either one of these people becoming president. My problem with Trump is he has failed too hard in a few key areas for me to vote for him. First off, Trump is a Keynesian. He believes that the government stimulates the economy. It's obvious that he supports this from his pushing of the PPP and the CARES Act, both of which I think were abysmal. I think they're unreasonable. I think they're going to, not only have they been impacting the debt, but they're contributing to the increasing decline of the U.S. dollar. His spending dwarfs the spending of his predecessors, Obama and Bush, and basically everybody before that. He's already added $8 trillion to the national debt in 3.5 years, and he was running these record deficits even before COVID. Now, I still remember the Tea Party era. I remember when people were bitching about government spending. Now, apparently those people have gone away. This isn't a problem anymore for them, but it should be, because it is a problem. His tariff and his trade war policies, they're just going to result in higher consumer prices. And the reality is that we benefit more from our trade with China than China does, considering that we give them increasingly useless dollars for their manufactured goods. We don't do manufacturing much here anymore. We certainly don't do enough for Americans to live on the standard that they currently live on. We would have to have a completely changed system. Now, is it possible that we could do that? Sure, but it is going to be a radical transformation in the American economy if we no longer did business with China. That's a reality. And the tariffs, obviously, as I touched on, are just taxes passed down to consumers. Just the way that corporate tax rates are costs that get passed down to consumers. That's basically how this works. Trump also flopped on his get us out of the Middle East stance pretty hard, signing an even bigger arms deal with Saudi Arabia. Obviously, it's the support that's going on in Yemen, all of the stuff that's going on in the Middle East. We're still in the same places Obama and Bush got us into. We're still bombing the same countries. It's like 7 countries that we're bombing, that we're involved in, that is just expanding the empire and just draining funds from us. Trump also goofed on guns. We had the bump stock ban, we had the 3D printed gun ban, and probably the bigger impact, because most gun owners didn't have bump stocks. Most gun owners right now don't give a shit about 3D printed guns, though the 3D printed guns is just an inevitability of the death of gun control, because you're not going to be able to stop anything when people can 3D print, gun parts and magazines and such. But the bigger one was Trump setting a standard for a lot of Republicans to follow in support of red flag laws. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar, red flag laws would mean that the government can come and seize your guns on a suspicion that you could do something that would be tragic or bad. Say your neighbor calls up and says, "Hey, I think the dude next door might be planning on shooting up the school or something," and the government can come up and take your guns and then put you through the process to find out if you were doing something wrong. Now, obviously, this goes 110% against the spirit of the Second Amendment. I would never support that unless there's really good justification, like clear threats or really sufficient evidence that someone was about to commit some horrible act of violence against someone else. Now, obviously, in that situation, I think that's a little bit different. That's something that should be concerning and people should act on. When the FBI is called 20 times before the kid shoots up the school because he's been bragging about how he's going to shoot up the school, that's a different situation than an anonymous tip from a neighbor that ends up in a no-knock raid where you get blasted. Now, again, these things aren't as bad as Biden's record, but they're too much to earn my vote. And the issue I see is that this election at this moment, I think, is kind of a toss-up. I actually expect Trump. I think he has better odds now than he had maybe a month ago or so. I kind of expect him to win re-election, and there's a few reasons for that, largely because Biden picked Kamala, which hurt him apparently in the polls, and the economy slowly showing signs of life. Some of the numbers coming back better than expected. I think the closer we get to November, if the economy does look any better, and we're seeing a trend of it looking better, obviously Trump's going to try to play that up as much as he can. But in terms of unemployment and consumer confidence, I think Trump will win the Rust Belt. I think he'll end up winning the election because Biden doesn't really seem to have anything to offer those people except for pretty vague platitudes. Really orange man bad stuff. And if that happens and Trump wins re-election, I think the same mobs who are currently looting and burning and destroying property around Portland and Seattle, New York, Chicago, I think they're all just going to expand that damage. You're going to see a lot more rioting and protesting if Trump wins, obviously. There's going to be a lot more than just screaming at the sky. I think there's going to be a lot of violent assaults, a lot of property damage especially. And by the way, I also expect the Dems to do exactly what they did last time and completely flip their position on election rigging. If Trump wins again, they're going to do what they did back in 2016, where beforehand they were like, oh, election rigging. No, you're just losing. And they swore there was no rigging before the election, but after Trump won, they spent 3 years trying to say it was rigged. Russia hacked it, yada, yada, yada. There's going to be something that go on that makes it illegitimate. In the same way, if Trump loses, I do not see Trump accepting the results of the election. I think he's too petty, and I think he's too egotistical to take that loss. And the bulk of his hardcore fans are just too conspiratorial to let that happen. And now, since they're trying to do this mail-in voting thing, it is kind of creating a little bit of shade around it where people are going to be able to argue, hey, how do I know my ballot even made it? Obviously, just because this is different than it has been, there's going to be some grounds there for conspiracy theories. Possibly if they don't have in-person debates as well, I see that hurting Trump. I think an in-person debate, for all three debates, if they have those and they have them in person, Trump's numbers will do better in that because that tends to be where he shines. But we'll see. I don't expect Trump to lose gracefully if he does. I don't think anybody really expects that, no matter what side of the political aisle you're on. It won't be a rollover loss for Trump. And I think to conclude this up, I think this is the best way to put this. The issue that we are at, in my summation, is that we have a very dark and hard future ahead of us if we continue to have a state, at least like this, that rules over all of us. There's so much that we don't agree on, and we fight with each other because it's being forced on us. It's kind of amazing how in private life we can disagree on a million things, and it rarely ever becomes violent or nearly as intense as politics is. Like, all my neighbors can go to whatever churches that they voluntarily choose to attend, and it doesn't bother me. And as an atheist, I choose not to attend any of those churches. And aside from, belief differences, it doesn't compel my neighbors to drag me with them. I've never had a neighbor that's just like, no, you got to come with me to church. They'll try to talk me into it, but there's never any sort of interaction where I'm like, wow, this person's about to try to force me to go to church. It's like we can coexist because neither one of us is coercing the other. We understand this. You can go to temple, you can go to synagogue, you can go to a mosque, you can go to church, you can refrain from doing any of these things, and we all seem to kind of get along, even if we disagree. But politics is dirty and divisive for the reason that it is entirely centered around us forcing each other to adhere to the other's ideas. And this is the greatest argument, I think, for, at a minimum, drastically reducing the role of the state in our lives. Less force, less coercion, less violence, and theft. That's at least where I think we should set the goal, and I'm not going to vote for either of these candidates because neither of them come even close to leading the country there.